Bias. It's a very problematic word. It can carry a lot of emotional baggage, and right now it's a very hard word in a very tough time. It makes people uncomfortable, defensive, upset, but also it's a hopeful word. This is because it is finally coming up in broad discussion across many industries. For many who have not had attention paid to the things that keep them from fully participating in all opportunities, for them, the conversation might be finally shifting to a place where the possibilities are expanding. And frankly, we may all be subject to bias at some point in our lives. It's time to be aware. It's time to make change. And that is good for everyone. And it's good for business. So what is bias? How can we recognize it? And what can we do to be aware of bias and make changes that benefit everyone? Thank you for being a part of this conversation, and we will explore these questions over the next several slides. Our hope is that by the end of this unit you will be able to recognize bias and its impacts. Recognize why bias is an important topic and in need of being addressed. Learn to recognize bias we ourselves may hold. Discover how to be aware and start to recognize where changes are needed. And finally, find new ways of overcoming bias in our training materials, and in ourselves. Bias can be defined as prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared to another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. More specifically, though, bias can be thought of better when understood from the perspective of unconscious bias. TalentCulture.com, in its article, The Truth About Unconscious Bias in the Workplace, defines it this way. Unconscious biases are social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside of their conscious awareness. Unconscious bias happens outside of our control. It occurs automatically and is triggered by our brain making quick judgment. In most cases, the people we work with, socialize with, have as clients, customers, and who are generally in our lives can be assumed to be good people. Many of us are considered to be kind, considerate, and understanding. But the fact remains, however, that research shows that you don't have to hold antisocial beliefs to have unconscious bias. You don't have to be actively racist or sexist to support racism or sexism. Neil Goodman, PhD, writes in an article for TrainingMag.com, unconscious bias is the result of messages from a wide array of sources introduced into our subconscious from an early age. Many of these prejudices that are deeply held in our unconscious can unconsciously influence how we act towards one another in our organizations. We are, unfortunately, not responsible for how prejudices form. We are responsible for recognizing them in ourselves now that we are aware they exist. We are responsible for how we deal with them moving forward. But why is it important to have an awareness? The Kirwan Institute, in its paper Implicit Bias, explains it this way. Our unconscious minds handle a tremendous amount of our cognition, even though we are completely unaware of it. Some data indicates that the brain can process roughly 11 million bits of information every second. The conscious mind handles no more than 40 to 50 of these information bits, with one estimate as low as a mere 16 bits. This is why mental shortcuts are not bad and even necessary to get through our day-to-day life. The problem is when these shortcuts impact an individual or group of people based on a lack of facts or despite them. Everyone is susceptible to implicit bias, even people who believe themselves to be impartial or objective, such as judges. Because implicit associations arise outside of conscious awareness, these associations do not necessarily align with individuals' openly held beliefs, or even reflect stances one would explicitly endorse. There are so many real-world effects of implicit biases across a range of domains: employment, criminal justice, healthcare. Hundreds of scientific studies have been done to explore this phenomenon, and many of these findings are very compelling. Consider these examples. In simulations where police were asked to make split-second decisions on whether subjects posed a threat or not, research indicated that participants are more likely to shoot simulated unarmed targets when they were represented as African American as opposed to white. It also indicated the reverse. Simulated armed targets were less likely to be shot if they were white as opposed to African American. In the health field, it has been documented that physicians are more likely to prescribe painkillers for white patients than black. In the hiring process and in other decision-making occasions, allowing adequate time to make decisions is vital. Research has demonstrated that time pressures create an environment in which unconscious biases can flourish. The Kirwan Institute paper explains, because these biases are activated on an unconscious level, it's not a matter of individuals knowingly acting in discriminatory ways. Implicit bias research tells us that you don't have to have negative intent in order to have discriminatory outcomes. That's a pretty huge statement when you think about it. In the workplace, this bias can have an impact on hiring, promotions, and feedback. This could harm diversity and make businesses less competitive. So how can we learn to recognize bias in ourselves? It's important that we continually hold up a mirror and examine where our biases exist. The Equity Assistance Center offers this list as a good starting point. Reflect on these and see how many you have noted from your workplace, or may even recognize in yourself. Invisibility. Certain groups can be underrepresented in official materials. The significant omission of women and minority groups can become so great as to imply that these groups are of less value, importance, and significance in our society. Stereotyping. By assigning traditional and rigid roles or attributes to a group, instructional materials stereotype and limit the abilities and potential of that group. Stereotyping denies students a knowledge of the diversity, complexity, and variation of any group of individuals. Imbalance and selectivity. Presenting only one interpretation of an issue, situation, or group of people. This imbalance restricts the knowledge of people regarding the varied perspectives that may apply to a particular situation. We want to be careful and not distort reality and ignore complex and differing viewpoints. Unreality. This is an unrealistic portrayal of our history and our contemporary life experience. Controversial topics are glossed over and discussions of discrimination and prejudice are avoided. This unrealistic coverage denies information needed to recognize, understand, and conquer the problems. Fragmentation and isolation. An example of this is that by separating issues related to minorities and women from the main body of the information, instructional materials imply that these issues are less important and not a part of the cultural mainstream. Linguistic bias. Curricular materials reflect the discriminatory nature of our language. Masculine terms and pronouns ranging from our forefathers to the generic he deny the participation of women in our society. More specifically to the workplace and the development of training materials, we can examine ourselves with the following biases presented by Andre May in a Dash and Thompson article from their website. Confirmation bias. The tendency to easily accept information that confirms your point of view and reject information that does not support it. Anchoring bias. The tendency to place excessive weight or importance on one piece of information, often the first piece of information you learned about a topic. Cursive knowledge bias. When well-informed people are unable to look at an issue from the perspective of a less informed person. Functional fixedness. This bias limits a person to utilizing an object or idea in only the way it was traditionally used. Mere exposure effect. The tendency to like something just because you're familiar with it. Not invented here bias. The tendency to discount information, ideas, standards, or products developed outside of a certain group. Reactance. The urge to do the opposite of what you're asked to do in order to preserve your freedom of choice. Status quo bias. The tendency to want things to stay relatively the same way they have always been. And finally, system justification bias. The tendency to try to actively maintain the status quo. As we examine ourselves and our surroundings and look for bias, what are we supposed to do when we find it? The Kirwan Institute has important things to keep in mind regarding this question as well. Once an implicit association is activated, it is difficult to inhibit. Despite what may feel like a natural inclination, attempts to debias by repressing biased thoughts are ineffective. Due to rebound effects, suppressing these automatic associations does not reduce them and may actually amplify them by making them hyper-accessible. A great way to debias is to openly acknowledge biases and then directly challenge or refute them. But there is good news. They also state our implicit biases are not permanent. They are malleable and can be changed by devoting intention, attention, and time to developing new associations. With that in mind, here are a few steps creating efforts to combat unconscious bias in the workplace and in training design. The Higher View website has these bits of advice. Set expectations and gather feedback. Let everyone know that this is a priority. Have preliminary surveys that seek to get information about feeling comfortable expressing true points of view and opinions in the workplace. Performance being fairly evaluated. Believing bias plays a role in the workplace. Being interested in participating in bias reduction initiatives. Describing what is thought of when thinking of bias. Indicating what sort of bias reduction program survey takers could look forward to participating in. Encourage elective participation. Counter to what you may expect, mandatory bias training has counterproductive effects in the workplace. Diversity can even go down as a result of mandatory meetings. They can create resistance among the people that need it most, and considering the learning biases mentioned earlier, this can cause a digging in effect for a number of reasons. However, if approached as an elective, it can create self-selected diversity champions who have an effect on their environment and raise the overall perspective of the workplace over time. Create bias awareness. When you have a willing volunteer, give them the tools to educate themselves. A good starting point is the Harvard project, Implicit. Have tangible goals with this training and provide real-life examples and experiences to help people reset their mindset. Create opportunities for in-group contact. Working with individuals of different groups is one of the most tried and true ways of breaking down reliance on stereotypes. Recognizing unconscious bias and its impact on diversity in the workplace is an important undertaking and one that can have tremendous dividends when addressed properly. We hope that through this introduction, you've been able to recognize bias and its impacts. Recognize why bias is an important topic and in need of being addressed. Learn to discover bias and recognize it in yourself. Discover how to be aware and recognize where changes are needed. And find new ways of overcoming bias. As Higher View points out, unconscious bias is the cognitive equivalent of muscle memory, coming into play when we are faced with gaps in our own personal experience. Due to the human brain's tendency to create shortcuts, everyone has unconscious biases. However, even though it can take time, meaningful change rarely happens overnight. Addressing unconscious bias is something that can have a lasting impact on both a company's culture and a company's competitiveness. And while it would be unrealistic to think we could ever completely eliminate bias, reducing bias as much as possible is a worthwhile endeavor with positive outcomes. We wish you great success with your efforts and even better success with the results. Thank you.